Hello and welcome back to our Daniel Bible study. This week we're looking at chapters 7 and 8. Now what's important to realize right now is all the familiar stories from Daniel are behind us. Chapters 7 through 12 are really the apocalyptic literature aspect of Daniel. And this means this is a lot like Revelation. It's going to be chock full of symbolism, and the scholars do not always agree on really what each thing means. There's always some debate. Now, part of this is how I take the apocalyptic literature, both here in Daniel, but also when we get to Revelation this fall. And that is that I view these passages as having a specific meaning for the people who first heard them. They have a meaning for those in the past. They have a meaning for us today, and they will have a meaning for those in the future. That's what makes God's word timeless. So when we look at this, a lot of this is going to fit with the ancient world. A lot of this is going to fit with the period of the Greeks dominating the Jews in between the two testaments and before the rise of Rome. But this is also going to apply to our world today. So I always say this is like reading Shakespeare. When I was in high school English, when we had to read the plays of William Shakespeare, our massive, thick English textbooks that are roughly the size of a good study Bible, if not larger, always had the original text on one side and a modern translation on the other to help make sense of what Shakespeare wrote. Because to the people at that time, the language used made perfect sense. For us today, it's a little different. So as we delve in here, read Daniel, listen, reread it, watch again if you have to. We're going to try to work through this. And again, this is why you have the small groups. This is why we have the Zoom session as well. So we're here in Daniel 7. And both 7 and 8 take place during the reign of King Belshazzar, the last of the Babylonian kings. This is the Belshazzar chapter 5 and the handwriting on the wall. He had a short reign. And this, again, shows us this is not a chronological book. These should have been in place before chapter 5 and Belshazzar's demise. But now they're in 7 and 8. And one of the things scholars do point out on this is really how much these passages fit with the rule of Antiochus IV Epiphanes in 167 BC. This is a time after the death of Alexander the Great when different families ruled what was left of, or basically ruled Alexander's empire when it was broken into 4 places, and we'll get into that. But here in chapter 7, we have the imagery of the 4 beasts that came from the sea. One of the things about the sea is a place of chaos. You can see this back in Genesis 1 with the God floating over the waters. The sea is also one of the, well, you can look at Jonah getting thrown into the sea. But also, when you get later in apocalyptic literature about the seas giving up the dead, there was often a belief that if you died at sea and your body wasn't recovered, you were lost. And using this, it was a kind of a force, a massive force. So this would be understandable for them that the beasts would come from the sea. And really, when you look at the animals coming out, and in chapter 7, specifically more around starting at verse 4, we have a lion with eagle's wings. A beast like that wouldn't come from the sea, so this is all symbolic. But when we look at this, all the animals, the lion with eagle's wings, the bear-like beast, the leopard with the 4 wings of a bird, and then the 4th beast, which had the iron teeth, 10 horns, and a new horn replacing the other 3. This is not literal. This is symbolic. And we should really understand this more and more because we use national symbols again. Like national symbols of animals For the United States, our national animal, that symbol, is the bald eagle. For Great Britain, it's the lion. Like different countries would do, Russia is the bear. I mean, some of these same things we still use today, which leads to some interpretations. And part of this does fall back when you think back to chapter 2, when we get the statue with the different materials. Some of these kind of line across. And I'm going to try to put up an image on this, because I have a chart here, and I'm going to try to throw it up, so hopefully it's here. But the idea that, like, the head of fine gold is the same as the lion with eagle's wings, being Babylon. The chest and arms of silver correlates to the bear, which is the Medo-Persian. And this also will go into chapter 8 as well, which this will be the ram with 2 horns. The belly and thighs of bronze fits with the leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, and later the male goat with a great horn, 4 horn, and little horns being the Greeks. And then the legs of iron, feet of iron and clay. That is the incomparable beast with 10 horns and a little horn, and that would be Rome. That is one interpretation of this. I have seen others that makes that last one, the dreadful, terrible beast, being the Greeks, which would fit with that interpretation of Antiochus IV Epiphanes being and his dominating action. But that 4th beast, that terrifying beast with iron teeth, which they're not even in the Iron Age yet, so that again translates into some of the thoughts that some was added later, described later. But some would place that with Revelation chapters 12 through 13, verse 10, being the dragon. And some of this language is also found in Job 26, verses 12 and 13, Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1, Isaiah 51, verses 9 through 11, and Revelation 13. A lot of this we can have different interpretations of this. Because we can look at some of this very things and apply this to different kingdoms today, which is why this is apocalyptic literature and kind of timeless. But we can also take this down to a different theological level, and that might be more helpful and important for us. Because theologically, we're looking really at the idea of a battle between good and evil. And where the lion would represent wild threats, the bear represents threats to human, the leopard with 4 wings can be interpreted as Darius, Cyrus, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes, or even the 4 corners of the earth. And getting to the idea of the battle between good and evil. Because in Western culture, you have to remember this, in Western culture we tend to raise up the Greeks and the Persians are seen as the enemy. In Old Testament Judaism, the Persians are the heroes, the Greeks are the enemy. And in this interpretation as well, with kind of that 4th animal being just no earthly animal just really fits the description. There is a thought that maybe it's an elephant. But they really do tie this to Antiochus IV. When we're looking in... when we look at this, because we can look at 1 Maccabees chapter 1 verse 24. When talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes, they say, taking them all, he went into his own land. He shed much blood and spoke with such great arrogance. Some of this would fit with kind of that same entity. But then again, when you get to the Christian era, the early Christians saw this as Rome with the Roman persecution. And I say all of this because there is no consensus. You can find what I said in certain scholars, I mean, the bibliographies in that workbook. You can also go back and find other people saying different things. I mean, we could, for fun, sit here and figure out who's what. But then again, we're not going to know the answer, because this is Daniel transmitting what he saw that he did not fully comprehend himself, and God giving him the interpretation. And for us, the big thing is we can see that God is in control over history because it's being foretold. But as you pick up in verse 9, we get the Ancient of Days reigns. This is where we get God's rule in the midst of the chaos of the earth. And starting in verse 9, as I looked, the thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and his hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its heels were burning fire. This language is biblical language to describe God. I mean, specifically, if you want to talk about the throne and God seated at the throne, Revelation 4, same language about the throne of God. And this is where you start to see some of the imagery of how we describe God or depict God. Like, why does God always have white hair? Well, the hair of his head like pure wool. Pure wool, white. This language also is in the Old Testament as well. 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 19, similar language. The language of fire. I mean, fire isn't, in this case, destructive. Fire being purifying. Psalm 97 uses a similar language. This is all common language to describe God and God's throne and God's reign. But then you get to 11, and we're getting that the horn was speaking. Horns don't speak. We know this. But that means the horn is symbolic. And here it's arrogance. And when we're looking at the beast itself, that animal with it, that would fit with Antiochus for Epiphanes being arrogant. It's the Antichrist. It's someone who is opposed to God and God's people. But then we get from there the ultimate defeat of that evil force by God. And this is an important part I would say really verses 11 and 12 are important for us, because this is, as much as we get scared with the apocalyptic literature or freaked out by it, in the end, we know how it ends. God wins. Here we get a teaching on arrogance, of God not being a fan of arrogance. We know God is a fan of humility. But also, it's a reminder that those who oppose God's people, those who persecute God's people, will be punished by God. And also, the fact that, as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. God still reigns. Kingdoms come and go. That's the sermon. It was a sermon for Sunday. But the kingdoms come and go, and God lets kingdoms rule. Earthly rulers only rule because God lets them, not because they are greater than God. And then in 13 and 14, and again, this fits heavily with the post-exile period and later Old Testament and into the Apocrypha section, because we're getting the foretelling of the apostle, or the Messiah. The Son of Man is given dominion, verses 13 and 14. He came like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days who was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and the kingdom of all the peoples, nations, languages who would serve him. Foretelling the coming of Christ. And that God was going to reach all of humanity through Christ. Now, that is the Christian interpretation of the Son of Man given dominion. Some more devout Jews would see this as the coming Messiah who has not yet come. Others see it as Gabriel or even the Archangel Michael. We're going to stick with the Christian interpretation of foretelling the Messiah. And again, important. Because as much as we're freaked out by the beast in the beginning of 7, in the end, Christ is going to come. Christ is going to reign. Christ's kingdom will not be destroyed. And again, Revelation. This reads just like it, except here it is centuries earlier. Whether you want to hold to the Daniel time or if you want to hold to the time of Antiochus, it's still, you're looking at 300 to 700 years in advance. The prophecy of the Messiah and Christ being foretold. And this is where we find hope. For all of apocalyptic literature in the Bible, the key lesson is hope is found in God. Regardless of how scary everything else is, hope is there. And it is scary because, well, we see it with Daniel in verse 15. He was anxious because of the visions in his head. He was alarmed. Yeah, it's that natural response. It's John of Patmos was the same way in Revelation. And Daniel is like us. He wants details. When you read through this, Daniel wants to know he wants to know who the beasts are. He wants the interpretation. But, in 18, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the land forever and ever. In the end, yeah, God still wins. He wants to know who the fourth beast is, with teeth of iron, claws of bronze, devoured and broke everything. And we do get it. And when we look at this, we're not given a name, which is important. Because if we'll truly be, it does fit for Antiochus IV Epiphanes. It also can fit with Nero. It can fit with a lot of the most heinous people who lived and reigned on earth. So, which does make it that timeless passage. But on the flip side, in the end, though, who wins? In the end, God will still win. Which, if you take nothing else from this chapter, that's what you take. And Daniel, though alarmed and fearful, he kept it internal. Because not everyone needs to find this. But if you want to take some time, I would say look over again verses 23 through 27 and think of who all you can place in that. What nations, what evil people you can fit that description. It does warn us of ultimately they will be judged and God will reign. Now as you move into chapter 8 itself is also during the reign of King Belshazzar, 3rd year, so 2 years after chapter 7. And in this place, they're in Susa, which would become the capital of the Persian Empire. And that is also where you get the story of Esther. And again, there's a dream. And going through this dream, it's again about an animal where a large male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth. That's starting in verse 5. And he came to a ram with 2 horns. Struck the ram, broke his horns. The ram had no power to stand against him and cast him down. This fits heavily with the agricultural society they were in. God uses what we understand to transmit the message. And this does fit with the idea of the conflict of nations. And there again are different interpretations depending on who you focus on. With the goat coming from the west, that is something that fit with describing the Greeks. The Greeks came from the west and destroyed the Persian Empire. You could also take this as the Medo-Persian Empire destroying Babylon. Because Media, where that empire was located, it was kind of to the up into modern day Turkey, so they could say it came from the west geographically. And it could show, so this passage can really show us this is Persian dominance. It can show us this is Greek dominance. And the Persian fits because they did use ram imagery. But the Greek fits as well, as they talk about the four horns. Because, starting in verse 8, then the goat became extremely great, but when it was strong, a great horn was broken, and instead there came up four conspicuous horns towards the four winds of heaven. This goes into Greek history with Alexander the Great, where Alexander had a great kingdom, great empire, truly. I mean, it stretched from really in the east with Greece and Rome, down into Egypt, all the way through the modern Middle East, into modern-day Iran, into Afghanistan, Pakistan, into India. This was a massive kingdom. After Alexander's death, his empire was broken into four parts, where we had the Cassander who ruled in Macedon and Greece, where kind of the homeland, the Lysimachus branch that ruled in Thrace, Asia Minor, which you're talking really modern-day Turkey, the Seleucids, who ruled in Syria and Babylon, and the Ptolemy, who ruled down in Egypt. The controversy a few years ago about Cleopatra and like why do they? She's African. Why is she always white? Well, she was Ptolemy. She was from that family. They're from Greece. That's why that's always there. Besides the fact Egypt's along the Mediterranean, not sub-Saharan. But that's a whole other thing. Anyway, so that's where this fits in, is that idea you have those four kingdoms. Basically, the empire is broken into four separate entities. The Seleucids ruled in Judea and Galilee, where the Jews really were, and that's where Antiochus IV Epiphanes came out of. So we can view this as that idea of a great empire coming in and being broken into four. It really does fit with the Greeks. But given the time period that I was given before the Median Persian takeover of Babylon, it fits there. But also, it could fit in the future as well. But starting verse 9, we get the little horn coming out too. Oh, yeah. And how that grew. And that, again, who is this? It's still all that symbolism. And there's debate over who all of that truly is. But in the end, through all of it, we really see who's in charge. God is in charge of the situation. Not the ram, not the goat. It is God. So in the midst of all the craziness, and you can go down those rabbit holes all you want, God still rules. But then starting in verse 15, we get a visitor. And this is where we get Gabriel coming into place. And Gabriel we'll hear more from him. And this would place this later in, makes it fit later in the period, and maybe the naming, as opposed to just a messenger, came later. But we're getting the angelic visitor, which we are more familiar with from the New Testament. And the big part of the rest of this chapter is Gabriel saying who this is. And that's where we say the goat is the king of Greece. Basically foretelling what is coming. For kingdom shall rise from the nation. That though some may question whether it applied more for later, which again, when I say apocalyptic literature, it applies for now, applies for the future, applies for later. we do see a foretelling that God is in control. And potentially, if we want to say this was edited later, it would make sense for that initial encounter to say this is the rise of Alexander and the Greeks who are going to cause us trouble. But again, we're reminded through this, especially at the end where they say about, and I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. This is something important about dreams and visions from angels. This was given directly to Daniel. We're going to hold that this one is true. But St. Jerome made this comment in his commentary. He points out that Daniel couldn't understand the dream. And it's important that not everyone can, as Jerome points out, not everyone can comprehend what they see or can read Scripture and understand it with their hearts. We can see things, we can try to understand things, we can read things, but we may not fully comprehend it, even if God gave it to us. And it could very well be all this was given and probably tweaked as they wrote it down as oral tradition came about. Let's remember, not everything, some was written in Hebrew, some in Aramaic. As we look at this does kind of sit back and go, you could potentially see this coming back, that original dream he couldn't really understand. But later they went, oh yes, this is what happened. 2 Maccabees 15, 11 through 14 kind of emphasizes this, that this is what is to happen. And that does remind us again of what St. Jerome did point out in his commentary. Especially as this is being said, that not the entire message, let me rephrase that. The message may be hidden and not accessible to people until after the events transpired. Not everything will be known to us. It doesn't mean that God doesn't know. And again, if we want to look through all of this, we can sit here and say God is in control. God knew what was going to happen. And if we trust that this prophecy is true, we can trust the others are true as well. So there you go. There is chapter 7 and 8. I encourage you, work on those reflection questions, meet in your groups, or join the group session. If you have any deeper questions, please feel free to reach out. But until next time, hopefully you learned something and hopefully you find a way that God is speaking to you through this text.